It was the 15th of January 1919, and 10-year-old Pasquale Iantosca was gathering pieces of firewood in Boston's North End. It was an ordinary errand that he had done many times before. Around him, the neighbourhood bustled with life. Horses pulled carts along Commercial Street, labourers moved between warehouses, and children played in the shadow of a giant steel tank filled with molasses. Nobody gave that tank much thought anymore. Its leaks and strange groaning noises had become so familiar that most people scarcely noticed them at all. Then, just after noon, the ground began to tremble. A deep metallic groan rumbled across the North End, and, in an instant, the towering tank exploded, unleashing a sticky tsunami that ripped through streets, damaged buildings, hurled cars and trucks skywards, and buried bystanders in its suffocating flood. In the blink of an eye, what should have been routine industrial storage became a deadly wave. One that claimed 21 lives, injured more than 150 people, and left the city reeling. Purity Distilling at 529 Commercial Street in Boston was responsible for unloading, storing and processing molasses delivered by ship. Molasses may seem like an unlikely industrial product today, but in 1919 it was enormously valuable. The thick, dark syrup left behind during sugar refining was fermented into industrial alcohol, which was used in everything from manufacturing and livestock feed to the production of munitions during and after the First World War. To store these vast quantities, the company relied on a series of enormous steel tanks, the largest of which stood 50 feet high and 90 feet across. It was capable of holding more than 2 million gallons of molasses. On paper, the tank appeared perfectly adequate. In reality, it was a disaster waiting to happen. The steel plates were dangerously thin and held together by poorly fitted rivets. Almost from the day it was built, the tank leaked. Molasses dribbled from its seams so frequently that neighbourhood children would sometimes collect it in tins and buckets to take home. Workers also spoke of strange groaning noises coming from inside the tank whenever it was filled, and those deep metallic sounds hinted that something was badly wrong. No proper testing had ever been carried out, and no one seemed willing to ask why a giant steel vessel filled with thousands of tons of syrup was creaking, leaking, and shuddering in the middle of a busy neighbourhood. The warnings were there for everyone to see. Nobody realised they were counting down to disaster. Then, at approximately 12:40 p.m, the giant steel tank finally gave way. There was a deep metallic groan, followed by a thunderous crack that echoed across the North End. Witnesses later said it sounded like machine gun fire. In an instant, millions of gallons of molasses burst from the ruptured tank. The wave surged through Commercial Street at speeds of up to 35 miles per hour, rising to the height of a 2-story building. In its path stood warehouses, homes, horses, workers returning from lunch, and a little boy carrying an armful of firewood. As it surged through the North End, it swept up steel, timber, carts and people alike. A worker on a nearby elevated railway platform said he felt the ground shake as though an earthquake had struck. Moments later, he watched in disbelief as a streetcar behind him was lifted from its rails. Buildings crumpled beneath the force of the impact. Others were torn from their foundations and swept aside like toys. One resident standing 2 blocks away recalled seeing what looked like a great brown wall racing towards him. And somewhere near a blacksmith's workshop, 10-year-old Pasquale was completely unaware that that wall of molasses was racing straight towards him. He would never make it home. People screamed and ran for their lives, only to stumble and disappear beneath the churning sea of syrup. The tank itself had exploded with such violence that steel plates and rivets were hurled through the air like shrapnel, striking people before the wave had even reached them. And then, almost as quickly as it had arrived, the flood began to slow. What had begun as a rushing wave soon turned into something far more sinister. A sticky, suffocating sludge that clung to people, animals and buildings alike, trapping the living and entombing the dead. For those caught in it, the nightmare was only beginning. The molasses had not simply knocked people down. It held them fast. Men and women struggled desperately to free themselves, only to find that every movement pulled them deeper into the thick, cooling syrup. Horses lay on their sides, screaming in terror, while children cried out for help from beneath shattered timber and twisted metal. Somewhere beneath that sea of brown was 10-year-old Pasquale Iantosca. As the molasses cooled in the January air, it became thicker and heavier, hardening around its victims. Rescuers later said that breathing became difficult as the syrup covered faces and filled mouths and noses. Every passing minute reduced the chances of survival. When help arrived, they were met by a scene that one newspaper reporter described as apocalyptic. Streets had become sticky rivers. Streetcars lay overturned. Buildings had collapsed into heaps of splintered wood and brick, and people and animals were sinking deeper with every frantic movement. Firefighters were among the first to reach the disaster zone. Axes swung as they hacked through broken fences and jammed doors in search of survivors. Police officers formed human chains, inching their way through the waist-deep molasses to pull the injured to safety. One local man, tied to a lamppost by a rope, waded chest-high into the syrup and emerged carrying an entire family in his arms. Doctors and medics worked alongside them, treating the injured wherever they could find space, tending to broken bones, crushed limbs, and the effects of exposure. But every rescue was a race against time. As afternoon gave way to evening, the temperature continued to fall, and the molasses became almost solid. Those still trapped beneath the wreckage or pinned within the syrup faced a horrifying fate. Some suffocated. Others simply could not be reached in time. The frantic struggle continued without pause for 4 days. Crews worked 12-hour shifts in freezing temperatures, their axes dulling and their ropes fraying, until finally there was no one left to rescue. Then began the enormous task of cleaning up. A fireboat pumped salt water into the sticky streets, while hundreds of volunteers spread sand in an attempt to absorb the syrup. More than 1,500 tons of molasses eventually found its way into Boston Harbor, coating docks and leaving a brown slick on the water. Even then, the disaster refused to let go of its victims. Some bodies remained so heavily coated in hardened molasses that identification proved difficult. In a few cases, families waited weeks or even months for confirmation that their loved ones had been found, with investigators relying on dental records and personal belongings to put names to the dead. And when the last of the molasses had finally been washed away, 21 people had lost their lives, and more than 150 others had been injured. But the people of Boston had also witnessed something extraordinary. In the midst of unimaginable horror, ordinary men and women had waded into a sea of syrup to save complete strangers, proving that even in humanity's darkest moments, compassion can still endure. In the weeks that followed, grief slowly gave way to anger. Local homeowners and businesses joined together to file one of Massachusetts' earliest class-action lawsuits against Purity Distilling, accusing the company of negligence in the design and maintenance of the tank. At first, the company denied responsibility. Its lawyers even suggested that anarchists may have deliberately blown up the tank, a claim for which no evidence was ever found. But as engineers examined the wreckage and eyewitness testimony began to emerge, a very different picture took shape. The giant steel vessel had been poorly designed, inadequately tested, and showing signs of failure long before the disaster. Eventually, Purity Distilling abandoned its defence and agreed to pay compensation to the victims and their families. Most received around $7,000, a substantial sum at the time, though no amount of money could restore what had been lost. The consequences of the disaster reached far beyond Boston. The Great Molasses Flood exposed serious weaknesses in how industrial structures were designed and approved across the United States. In the years that followed, new standards required large storage tanks to undergo rigorous testing and to be certified by qualified engineers before being put into service. It was a painful lesson, written in syrup, steel, and 21 lives. Investigators eventually concluded that the disaster had been years in the making. The tank's steel walls were too thin, its rivets were weak, and warning signs had been ignored almost from the day it was built. Then, on the day before the disaster, a fresh shipment of warmer molasses was pumped into the tank. The rise in temperature increased the pressure inside, while gases produced by fermentation added still more strain to the aging structure. It was simply more than the tank could bear. At 12:40 p.m. on the 15th of January 1919, the weakened seams finally gave way, and more than 2 million gallons of molasses poured into the streets of Boston. Today, the place where that deadly wave swept through the North End is a quiet public park and baseball field, marked only by a small bronze plaque bearing the names of the 21 people who never came home. Among them is 10-year-old Pasquale Iantosca, the little boy who had set out that afternoon to gather firewood and never returned. Yet the legacy of the Great Molasses Flood reaches far beyond that small memorial. The disaster transformed the way that large industrial structures were designed, tested and approved in the United States, helping to prevent similar failures in the years that followed. And in Boston, the memory of that day still lingers. Residents sometimes claim that on unusually warm January afternoons, they can catch the faint, sweet smell of molasses on the air. Perhaps it's only imagination, or perhaps it's simply a city's way of remembering. Because long after the streets were cleaned and the wreckage cleared away, the Great Molasses Flood left behind something far more enduring than syrup. It left behind a lesson that even familiar things can become deadly when warning signs are ignored, corners are cut, and profit is placed above safety. And that some tragedies are remembered not because of how they happened, but because of the lives that were swept away when they did, including a little boy who had simply gone out to collect firewood. Now, this was a dreadful occurrence, and I can't even imagine what it must have been like to be standing in the street, seeing that wall of syrup just hurtling towards you. Despite the nature of the tragedy, I hope you appreciated the way the information was presented. I'll see you on the next one, and I'll wish you bye-bye for now.